Let's talk about the nervous system. Just like Frankenstein's monster Adam, we run on electricity. Without millions of electrical currents coursing through our body from one moment to the next, we wouldn't be the highly complex organisms that humans have become. Electrical impulses cause our hearts to beat, our muscles to contract, our eyes to see, and our brains to interpret and store away every experience that we have. The nervous system can be divided into the central nervous system, made up of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves extending from and to the spinal cord, spinal nerves, and the cranial nerves coming directly to and from the brain, innervating the face, neck, digestive system, heart, and lungs. Nerves are bundles of many neuron axons and blood vessels surrounded by connective tissue. Nerves run to and service a specific part of the body. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The lump of grey matter nestled snugly inside your skull is actually highly structured. A slice of the brain reveals that grey matter exists as a thin layer around the outside of a mass of white matter, with a central core of grey matter. The outer grey matter, which is made up of the cell bodies of our cerebral cortex, grows so rapidly during development that our brains have become wrinkled and folded, where other animals' brains appear to be much smoother. These folds gyri and grooves sulci allow us to identify and locate structures within a brain that otherwise just looks like a lump of jelly. The brain is divided in half by the longitudinal fissure, giving rise to the left and right cerebral hemispheres. The left and right cerebral hemispheres are able to talk to each other via a group of interconnecting neurons called the corpus callosum. Our brains can be further divided into the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. Much of the forebrain is dedicated to interpreting and responding to the world around us. Hence, the sensory and motor cortex can be located here, as well as areas which enable us to understand and produce speech, interpret information coming through the eyes, and large regions identified as being related to emotions. Part of the forebrain known as the prefrontal cortex is involved in decision making. Many of you will revisit this area later. The four lobes of the forebrain are named according to the bones of the skull under which they reside: frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital. There are a number of important areas associated with the internal core of grey matter of the forebrain, including the basal ganglia, which are important for relaying motor information and are affected by Parkinson's disease, and the thalamus and hypothalamus, which have extremely important roles in sensing changes to our internal environment, regulating the autonomic nervous system, and controlling hormone release. The midbrain contains neurons dedicated to auditory and visual reflexes and relays information between the cortex and the spinal cord. The hindbrain is made up of the pons and medulla oblongata and controls many of our more basic but essential functions such as respiration, heart rate, blood vessel diameter, vomiting, and coughing. And finally, we have the cerebellum, which sits out the back and is more densely packed and folded than any other part of our brain and is essential for movement coordination and balance. As with all our organs, the brain and spinal cord also have a series of connective tissue layers which provide protection for the brain: the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. Cerebral spinal fluid is a clear fluid that circulates in the subarachnoid space between the pia mater and arachnoid matter of the brain and spinal cord and through ventricles in the brain. The cerebrospinal fluid provides some cushioning for the brain as well as protects the brain from chemical injury. The cerebrospinal fluid, along with hundreds of capillaries, delivers oxygen and glucose to the brain. These capillaries have tight junctions which prevent many molecules entering the brain. This added chemical protection is known as the blood-brain barrier, and while extremely important for protecting the brain, can make it difficult to treat diseases of the brain with chemical medicines. The spinal cord has a similar macroscopic anatomy to the brain with a central core of grey matter and then a layer of white matter. However, it lacks the final outer layer of grey matter and looks a little like a butterfly in cross-section. The axons of motor neurons project from the spinal cord and the spinal nerves, emerging between the gaps between the vertebrae. Axons of sensory neurons project into the spinal cord via the spinal nerves, relaying the sensory inputs up to the brain. Rapid responses to stimuli such as noxious cold, coming from the skin, arises from spinal reflexes which are designed to protect us: homeostasis. The spinal reflex arc is made up of 5 structures: the sense receptor, the sensory or afferent neuron, the integrating center or interneurons within the CNS, the motor neuron or efferent neuron, and the effector muscle or gland which creates the response. Common motor reflexes include the stretch reflex with muscle spindles as the sensor, the tendon reflex with the Golgi tendon organ as the sensor, and the withdrawal reflex with pain receptors as the sensor. The peripheral nervous system can be divided into the somatic and autonomic nervous system, and also the enteric nervous system, which is your gastrointestinal system's own primitive brain. The somatic nervous system includes all the sensory neurons from the special senses vision, hearing, taste, smell, and equilibrium, and the somatic senses pain, thermal, tactile, and proprioception, and all the somatic motor neurons controlling voluntary movement of the skeletal muscles. Therefore, the somatic nervous system is responsible for conscious sense and conscious movement. The autonomic nervous system primarily senses changes to the internal environment such as chemical changes, mechanical changes, and includes those baroreceptors you came across while looking at blood pressure homeostasis. As we saw in our investigation of muscle types, the autonomic nervous system innervates the cardiac and smooth muscle and also glands. The autonomic nervous system differs from the somatic nervous system in that it can create excitatory or inhibitory effects, whereas the somatic is only excitatory, and therefore releases both acetylcholine and norepinephrine, and also has two different types of neurotransmitter receptors. This becomes important when trying to understand side effects of neuroactive pharmaceuticals which act via neurotransmitters. The autonomic nervous system can be divided further into sympathetic and parasympathetic, which play an important role in controlling our state of arousal. You may have heard of fight or flight. This is a state of heightened arousal controlled predominantly by the sympathetic nervous system. Our heart rate and breathing increases, blood is diverted away from our digestive system and towards our muscles, and all functions not required to fight or get the heck out of Dodge, such as urination, defecation, and hunger, are suppressed. The brain also turns on to high alert with your hearing and vision more highly tuned and causes the release of stress hormones cortisol and adrenaline. In general terms, the parasympathetic nervous system has the opposite effect, gearing your body towards rest, relaxation, and digestion. The high stress environment that we live in today means that many people spend a large majority of their lives ready to run away from that tiger. And a lot of modern diseases can in part be attributed to this continued state of arousal, which we will look at in more detail when we get to the endocrine system. Neurons are highly specialized cells adapted to allow communication. In general, neurons have a cell body which contains the nucleus, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi bodies, and mitochondria. Sprouting from the top of the cell body are many short extensions known as dendrites which receive signals. A single axon of varying length and diameter extends from the base of the cell body, transmitting the signal to other cells and parts of the body. The base of the axon is often split into a number of extensions, allowing the axon terminus to interact with a number of other neurons or a number of muscle fibers in a motor unit. The junction between an axon and the cell it is communicating with is known as the synapse. The axon terminus is packed full of vesicles containing neurotransmitters ready to be released into the synaptic space to transmit the message from one cell to another. Axons are associated with special cells known as oligodendrocytes in the CNS and Schwann cells in the PNS, which wrap the axon in multiple layers of cell lipid bilayer, creating an insulating effect known as myelin, hence why the white matter is white.